Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote: opportunities multiply as they are seized. From the ancient Chinese general, military strategist, writer and philosopher Sun Tzu. A brief review of the last part where we started part 2 of the book Position Play and begin the first chapter in it. The conception of position play and the problem of the center. We discuss the topics: interrelation of the elements and position play, misconceptions about position play, and the principle of overprotection with illustrations given by Nimzowitsch. So now, moving further into the book, Nimzowitsch continues the discussion related to the principle of overprotection and rights. We note then that the prevention of freeing pawn moves, as far as this appears necessary and feasible, is of great importance in position play. Such prevention is what we wish to be understood as an exterior prophylactic. It is much more difficult to grasp the idea of an interior prophylactic, for here we have to do with an entirely new conception. We are in fact now concerned with the warding off of an evil which has never really been understood as one, yet which can, and in general does, have a most disturbing effect on our game. The evil consists in this, that our pieces are out of or in insufficient contact with our own strategically important points. Since I conceived of this condition as an evil, I was led to advance the strategical proposition that one must overprotect their own strategically important points. That is, provide defense in excess of attack. Lay up a store of defense. My formulation of this argument runs as follows: weak points, still more strong points, in short, everything that we can include in the collective conception of strategically important points ought to be overprotected. If the pieces are so engaged, they get their reward in the fact that they will then find themselves well posted in every respect. There are two explanatory remarks to be made here. Firstly, that as we have incidentally shown in our discussion of the passed pawn, we have the enigmatical or puzzling circumstance that blockading squares prove themselves as a rule to be in every respect good squares. And the pieces detailed for dull blockade duty find unexpectedly their reward in the possibility of a heightened activity from their blockading station. Just as in a fairy tale where good deeds are always rewarded, the idea of overprotection is in a certain sense no other than that above sketched, though in an expanded form, as we may see from the following example. See the position on board. Here we overprotect the strong pawn at e5, which has been pushed forward. The defense afforded by the d-pawn is insufficient, since white plans to reply to c5 by d takes on c5 equals to surrender of the base of their chain, and occupation of the point d4 now become free. We overprotect the e-pawn by pieces thus: knight d2, and the game Nimzowitsch vs. Guys 1913 continued. Knight e7, knight f3, knight g6, rook e1, and bishop b4. To get the bishop finally to c7, and then, despite the overprotection of white's e-pawn, to play f6. c3, bishop a5, and bishop f4, the third overprotection. Castling, bishop g3, bishop c7, and knight g5. And now the inner strength of overprotection is manifested in a drastic manner. The seemingly lifeless overprotectors, the knight at f3, the bishop at f4, and that old blade, the rook at e1, suddenly raise a considerable hubbub. Rook e8, knight f4, knight h8, queen g4, knight f8, and rook e3. The old soldier sniffs a fight and rejoices. b6. Rather better was bishop d8. So b6, knight h5, knight g6, rook f3, and rook e7, knight f6 check, king h8, and now white could win right off by knight takes on h7. Knight takes on h7, knight takes on f7 check, rook takes on f7, and rook takes on f7. The idea was the following. It was a good deed to overprotect a strategically important point. The reward came in the form of a large radius of activity for the pieces engaged on that service. Just one more example, for later on a whole chapter will be devoted to overprotection in all its bearings. See the position on board. After rook d1 and rook e8, there followed a maneuver which seemed most surprising. Rook d2 and rook f to d1. Why? Because the queen at d3 and perhaps too the pawn at d4 is the keystone of white's position, and hence overprotection is indicated. And in fact, after a few moves, the two rooks prove to be most serviceable combatants. They protect their own king excellently. After rook d2, the continuation was queen g5, rook d1, bishop a7, knight f4, knight f5, knight b5, bishop b8, and now rook e2 and rook d to e1 ought to have been played, when the overprotectors would have reaped their merited reward. Secondly, the rule for overprotection applies as is natural, most particularly to strong points, to important squares in the center, which are likely to come under heavy fire, to strong blockading squares, or to strong passed pawns, and so on. Ordinary weak points should under no circumstances be overprotected, for this might very well lead to the defenders getting into passive positions. However, a weak pawn that forms the base of an important pawn chain may and should be well overprotected. To illustrate this, let us return to our old friend, the pawn chain made up of the D and E pawns on each side. See the position on board and compare it with this position. In the former, the rooks protect the weak base of the pawn chain. Every such base is in a certain sense to be classed as weak, since the one sure defense by a pawn is wanting or missing. Yet this protection stands the strong pawn at e5 also in good stead, for as we know, the strengthening of the base involves at the same time a strengthening throughout the whole chain. The reader is advised to play over again my game. See game number 20 of the illustrative game section against Dr. Tarash, in which, after first laboriously overprotecting the point d4, having achieved my purpose, I got a strong attack which led to victory. The soul of that attack was, however, the pawn at e5, who could, so to speak, trustfully lean up against the d-pawn, who by that time was thoroughly healthy. Please note that this game has already been covered in part 28 of this video series, so anyone can roll back to that part in order to go through the game once again. Nimzowitsch continues. On the other hand, in the position shown here, the pawn at e5 is wanting or missing, and hence the role which the rook at d1 and rook at d3 would otherwise have had to play is much restricted. In fact, of the once so responsible role, nothing remains but the tedious obligations of preventing the pawn at d4 from going under. In other words, the disposition of the overprotection in the case of this position does not carry with it any sort of plan of attack for the future, in marked contrast to the case of the previous position, and consequently we get nothing but that passive disposition of defending pieces, against which we had to register so emphatic a warning. Nimzowitsch gives an additional description of both positions alongside their respective diagrams in the book. Of this position he writes, the safeguarded base at d4 increases the importance of the attacking wedge pawn at e5. The heaping up of rooks acts therefore as a deliberate overprotection. Regarding this position, Nimzowitsch writes, here the piling up of white's rooks does not have the effect of overprotection, but absolutely that of a passive defensive position which is classed as an evil. Nimzowitsch closes the discussion on this topic with the following. To recapitulate, the law of overprotection applies in general only to strong points. Weak points can only lay claim to overprotection in such cases where they help to support other and strong points. Moving further, Nimzowitsch begins the next topic with the heading number 4, side by side, with the idea of prophylactic, that of the collective mobility of a pawn mass is a main postulate of my teaching on position play. Nimzowitsch writes, in the last resort, position play is nothing other than a fight between mobility of the pawn mass on the one side and efforts to restrain this on the other. In this all-embracing struggle, the intrinsically very important device of the prophylactic is merely a means to an end. It is of the greatest importance to strive for the mobility of our pawn mass, for a mobile mass can exercise a crushing effect in its lust to expand. This mobility is not always injured by the presence of a pawn that has possibly remained behind in the general advance, that is, by a backward pawn, who can perhaps be used as a nurse to tend the pawn's fellows at the front. In the case of a mobile pawn mass, we must therefore look for collective and not individual mobility or each pawn for itself. For instance, in the position on board, we would expect sooner or later the leveling advance d4 in order to be rid of the backward pawn. In the game, however, there was played more correctly f4, queen e7, e4, bishop e6, g4, and white won easily. See game number 25 of the illustrative game section, Aron Nimzowitsch versus Dr. Walter Michel, 1926. Please note that we shall go through this game in its entirety towards the end of the video series, along with other remaining games from the illustrative game section of the book. Nimzowitsch writes of this position alongside a diagram in the book as follows. The pawns at e4, f4 and g4 in conjunction with the diagonal b2 to h8 lurking in the rear form the storm troops. The backward d pawn safeguards the c pawn and e pawn after d3. Nimzowitsch gives another example of the same concept and writes, again, in my game against Rubinstein, Black, in Dresden 1926, see game number 33 of the illustrative game section of the book, I was in no hurry to get rid of my backward pawn. Once again, please note that we shall go through this game in its entirety as well towards the end of the video series, along with other remaining games from the illustrative game section of the book. Nimzowitsch continues, thus, if after the opening moves c4, c5, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, d5, c takes on d5, knight takes on d5, e4, knight b4, bishop c4, e6, and castling. Black had played a6. I should not have been in any hurry to advance the backward d pawn. For d4, c takes on d4, queen takes on d4, queen takes on d4, knight takes on d4, bishop c5, bishop e3, bishop takes on d4, bishop takes on d4, knight c2, rook d1, knight takes on d4, rook takes on d4, knight c6, rook d2, and b5, followed by bishop b7 and king e7 would have only led to an equal game. I should rather, after a3 and knight c6, have chosen d3, and after bishop e3 and marshalling my major pieces, I should have been well prepared to attack. In the game, he played knight c6 instead of a6. So knight c6, and after d3, knight d4, else a3. So knight d4, knight takes on d4, c takes on d4, and knight e2 White got after f4 a mobile pawn mass effectively supported by the bishop at c4. We will now turn our attention to that terrible region in which the amateur and on occasion also the master only too often trips up, namely the center. Moving further, Nimzowitsch begins the next topic with a heading number 5, the center. Insufficient watch kept on the central territory as a typical and ever-recurring error. The center as the Balkans of the chessboard. On the popular but strategically doubtful diversion of the attack from the center to the wings. On the invasion of the center. The occupation of central squares. Nimzowitsch writes, it may be taken in common knowledge that in certain positions it is necessary to direct our pieces against the enemy center. For instance, in positions characterized by the presence of white pawns at e4 and f4, and of black pawns at d6 and f7, or white at d4 and c4, black at c7 and e6. On the other hand, it is not so well known that it is a strategical necessity to keep the center under observation, even if it be fairly well barricaded. The center is the Balkans of the chessboard. Fighting may at any moment break out there. Take the position already discussed previously in part 1 of the book, which from the point of view of the center seems harmless enough, yet after the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, knight c3, knight f6, d3, d6, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, g5, and bishop g3. Black center is threatened by two raids. Number 1, bishop b5 and d4. Number 2, knight d5 followed by c3 and d4. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowitsch My System here, and we shall continue onwards from the next part. Here is a look at the recent channel support from my Twitch stream. Several new supporters: Collision0912, Taborich, Obsidian, Lowell for Life, nfds, and Julesy18. Thank you for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.